Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming here today on this rainy day. Today, we're going to be talking about what the election results mean for us as advisors and estate planners, and what are we communicating to our clients, which I think is something that everybody's thinking about. We're going to start with an overview of the current Trump administration tax policy objectives. We're going to review the applicable congressional procedures and how these mechanics limit or impact what the administration is actually able to accomplish. We're going to discuss how does that provide us with insight into what we are likely to see in terms of the estate, gift, and generation skipping transfer tax exemptions. And then we're going to talk about what type of planning opportunities that we should be focusing on in the near future and what are we communicating to our clients. So to begin, here are some highlights of the Trump administration tax policy. First, as I'm sure all of you are familiar, extension of the individual income tax provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, the TCJA. This includes reduced tax rates, doubled standard deduction, increased child tax credit, and a cap on mortgage interest deductions, amongst other things. This excludes the $10,000 cap on state and local tax deductions, which is an important point. Extension of the TCJA, estate, gift, and generation skipping transfer tax changes, GST, currently $10 million indexed for inflation through 2025. There's also talk of no income tax on Social Security, overtime, and tips, and cutting the corporate tax rate further from 21% to 20% or 15% in some specific situations. So we've been here before. What do I mean by this? I think it's helpful to look back to the George W. Bush campaign and tax cuts that were enacted under the George W. Bush administration early on to provide us with some insight into what's possible under a new Trump administration as it relates to estate, gift, and GST taxes. George W. Bush 2001 and 2003 tax cuts, referred to as the Bush tax cuts, significantly reduced income tax rates and tax rates on capital gains and dividends. When running for president, George W. Bush campaigned heavily on complete repeal of the estate tax. It was one of his number one domestic agendas. But even with really favorable facts, like really favorable, Republican-controlled Senate, Republican-controlled House, Republican presidency, and a budget surplus, he still wasn't able to accomplish a complete estate tax repeal. Why? Because of the cost of his income tax cuts. Also, the Bush tax cuts were enacted through a process called budget reconciliation, which we're going to review together, which prevented complete estate tax repeal. So, instead, the 2001 tax cuts slowly phased out the estate tax with a temporary repeal in 2010, return in 2011, which then extended the exemption in weaker form. Interesting fact, the Bush tax cuts were responsible for 1/3 of the federal debt owed as of 2018. So it's expensive. So what do the Bush tax cuts and the TCJA have in common? They were both enacted through a congressional process called budget reconciliation. What is budget reconciliation? Budget reconciliation is a procedure used by Congress. It began in 1974 to enact legislation on taxes and spending with only a majority vote required in the Senate. So this avoids the 60-vote supermajority and the filibuster. Important to note that with this next administration, we only have 53 Republican seats. So even though the Republicans control the Senate, they don't have enough votes to meet that 60-vote supermajority unless they get 7 Democrats on board with their policy. So another important point with budget reconciliation is the Byrd Rule, which began in 1985 or 86, named after Robert Byrd. A budget reconciliation bill cannot increase the deficit beyond the budget window, which is 10 years. So that's the Byrd Rule. So this limits what can be done by the 53 Republicans with only a majority through budget reconciliation. So this was what prevented the Bush administration from getting through a complete estate tax repeal, and this is what will likely prevent the Trump administration from doing something similar. So anything that is done by the Trump administration in terms of taxes and spending will be likely done through the budget reconciliation process, therefore, limiting the length, the duration of an extension to 10 years. And here I just have an illustration of pieces of legislation enacted through budget reconciliation over the past 23 years. You can see 2001, 2003 Bush tax cuts and also the TCJA in 2017. So what are the costs of what the Trump administration wants to do, and how do we pay for it? So a lot of this discussion is based on what level of increased national debt the Republicans are comfortable with. Because of the national debt at this point, it's just a matter of how much more are they comfortable with taking on. So extending the tax cuts under the TCJA for an additional 10 years is a total cost of $4.2 trillion. This does not include not taxing Social Security, tips, and overtime. So that's an additional cost that's not factored into the $4.2 trillion. So how do we pay for that? I'm sure you've all heard the Trump administration talk about tariffs as the solution to this. There's been a proposal of a 60% tariff on goods from China, a universal tariff of up to 20% on all US imported goods. Since preparing this presentation, Canada and Mexico have been added to the list as the solve, the revenue producer that's going to pay for all of these tax cuts. I think it's important for all of us to understand what a tariff is and the limitations of tariffs and how that plays into, in the end, what tax policy we're likely to see. So a tariff is a tax on imported goods. Importantly, who pays the tariff? American companies. So it's not the foreign manufacturer, it's the American companies that are paying. What's the intent of a tariff? It's usually to protect domestic companies and manufacturers or punish foreign countries, retaliatory tariffs. Who authorizes tariffs? Important. The president can authorize tariffs. And how much revenue will the proposed Trump tariffs generate? So just for example, a 20% universal tariff would generate $2.8 trillion over a decade. That $2.8 trillion number is partially offset by the shrinkage of the US economy that's caused by tariffs, which I'm going to talk about a little bit with an illustration. Exciting. So some economists think that tariffs might cause enough economic damage to totally offset the economic benefits of the TCJA if extended for 10 years. So that's a huge issue that I think most people aren't really paying much attention to. So here we have a great illustration to talk about tariffs. In this example, we're talking about shoes, imported shoes. We have a 20% tariff on shoes being imported from a foreign country. The foreign manufacturer is Worldwide Shoes, and the company buying the shoes from Worldwide Shoes in the United States is US Sneakers. So each pair of shoes originally cost $100. There's a 20% tariff. That means each pair of shoes is now $120. Who pays that extra $20? US Sneakers. How is US Sneakers going to handle that increased cost of $20 per shoe? They can either absorb the cost, which means charging the same, so $100, they don't change what they're charging the consumer, but they're making less profit. So how do they handle that internally? They lay off people, they start paying their employees less. Or the company can pass along the cost to the consumer, and then the consumer pays more for the shoe. They pay $20 more. What does the consumer do? They either stop purchasing the shoe, or they pay a higher price for the shoe, and then they have less income to spend elsewhere, which is the example of, reducing a consumer's buying power, and in the worst case scenario, completely offsetting the benefits that are produced by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act over a 10-year period. So you're thinking, why are we talking about tariffs and budget reconciliation, and what is she doing? So what does this mean? I think it's important for us to understand the process through which tax policy in this particular administration is going to get passed, because it limits what can be done. So because of the Byrd Rule, which we reviewed earlier, and a divided Congress, the Trump administration can't do it all. They can't get everything that they want accomplished. Given the large national deficit, which I talked about earlier, it becomes a matter of prioritization. So structuring legislation to maximize income tax cuts when people generally, polling suggests, don't necessarily care about the estate tax. Income tax reductions affect most all taxpayers. The estate tax impacts so few people, 0.2%, and the impact is so far in the future. So income tax cuts are much more popular. It's something that the Trump administration campaigned on. That's going to be the priority. And if sunsetting the estate tax exemption allows for more income tax cuts, I think that's what we would see. And important to note that the Trump campaign didn't really campaign on estate tax repeal or estate tax restructuring at all. So what are we likely to see? We're not likely to see a repeal. We're most likely to see TCJA extension or a sunsetting, like I just described. When you're discussing this with your clients, estate planning is always important. There are non-estate tax reasons for planning. So taking a more holistic approach. It's not all about taxes. We're going to talk a little bit about non-estate tax reasons for planning at the end of this presentation. But it's super important to communicate this to clients and having a long-term flexible view when you're doing tax planning, because estate tax laws are ever changing. Different administrations are going to have different policies. Just not planning for the next 4 years, but planning for the future. So definitely communicating that to clients is really important. So how does this impact different strata of clients? So for high net worth couples with assets in excess of 50 million, nothing has really changed. We're still moving forward with exemption planning. Given the uncertainty, we still want to use the bonus exemption. For married clients with less than $14 million, you probably weren't doing exemption planning anyway. So you're still doing planning for those non-estate tax reasons, incapacity, asset protection, which we'll talk about. And for high net worth couples with assets between 14 million and 50 million, exemption planning should focus on flexibility. So you're securing some of that bonus exemption by making gifts to a trust that provides flexibility if laws change, which I'll talk about. So, if maybe you have clients that are saying, oh, well, I don't need to do anything. It's not that big of a deal. We'll have exemption. We don't have to worry about it going away. That's wrong. You still need to do planning. I think importantly, you don't want to forget about the power of compounding, the power of lifetime gifting. This hasn't changed either. You have high net worth clients, they're making a gift this year of using all of their exemption. What does that look like in 20 years with a 6% annual rate of return? You've transferred $87 million out of your estate and you've saved $35 million worth of estate tax, reminding clients about the power of compounding. That hasn't changed. We don't know what exemptions are going to look like in the future, and it's still really important to get appreciation out of your estate. Really, really important to remind clients about that. Some flexible planning opportunities that you can use during a term of uncertainty like we have over the next year and a half. SLATs, spousal lifetime access trusts, you're all familiar with these. They're always a good option. In most cases, donor spouse is creating a trust for the benefit of beneficiary spouse and descendants. The spouse as beneficiary has access to income in principle for household needs if necessary. Risks are if beneficiary spouse dies or there's a divorce, then beneficiary spouse ceases to be a beneficiary, and then donor spouse doesn't have any access through the spouse to the trust assets. These types of trusts also provide asset protection, so you're not just transferring assets to your spouse outright. They provide a level of protection to the spouse and other beneficiaries. Another flexible planning opportunity, not as popular, but still really good option, is an inter vivos Q-tip trust. This is a trust created by one spouse for the benefit of another. It's a completed gift for gift and estate tax purposes, qualifies for the unlimited marital deduction, provides asset protection like a SLAT. Requirements are similar to a testamentary Q-tip. The real key here is the timeline, the timing. So if you create and fund in January 2025 an inter vivos Q-tip, so the key is not to do it now, but wait until January. You have until technically April of 2026 to file a gift tax return, a 709, to make a Q-tip election. You can put that on extension, so it gets you to October of 2026 to make a Q-tip election. So it gives you time to see what happens with the exemptions. So let's say the TCJ is not extended and you want to use your bonus exemption, then you don't make a Q-tip election. If the TCJ is extended and the client, regrets making a large gift, then you make a Q-tip election on a timely filed Form 709. You don't use your exemption, and the spouse beneficiary can receive back the assets from the trust either over time or if the independent trustee has the power to terminate the trust under the document, they can do that, and the beneficiary spouse can get the assets back. So a good option to provide flexibility to clients that are unsure of what they want to do. Non-estate tax planning reasons. Usually clients are thinking about, or they should be thinking about, asset protection regardless of how much money they have. So in Connecticut, we allow for self-settled asset protection trusts. So a grantor can create a trust for the benefit of themselves, which provides protection against a variety of different creditors. There's also asset protection trusts for children, grandchildren, asset protection trusts for spouse. These can be, standalone inter vivos trusts. These can be structured as continuing trusts under a revocable trust, providing protection against creditors. And also, for instance, in a SLAT, you're providing the ability of the grantor spouse to control the remainder distribution. So if grantor spouse dies, beneficiary spouse remarries, grantor spouse knows that the remainder hopefully will pass to who they intended. So that's a really solid benefit. And finally, the most basic of reasons, incapacity and testamentary planning. So for incapacity planning, I'm sure you're all familiar. If your client's unable to manage their affairs during their lifetime, what documents do you need? Durable powers of attorney, advanced medical directives, revocable trusts. All of these documents allow for your clients to potentially avoid a conservatorship proceeding in probate court, which is a really good thing. And then finally, testamentary planning, always important. Wills, revocable trusts, providing appointments of guardians, protecting minor beneficiaries with trusts, minimizing the role of the probate court in the disposition and division of assets, avoiding the applicability of the laws of intestacy, where assets might pass to unintended beneficiaries, and someone that the decedent didn't want could be appointed to manage the trust assets and not be very good at it. So there are so many non-estate tax reasons for planning that clients should be reminded of, even if they're hesitant to make gifts. But if they are, there's flexible planning opportunities that we can utilize as planners if we do have a little bit of an uncertainty with our clients at this very moment. So in light of everything we've talked about, I would say the takeaways are, we're likely looking at a sunset or an extension of the TCJA exemptions. And focusing on, with our clients, flexibility, a long-term planning approach, I think, is really the key to getting through the next year or two with our clients. So thank you